What I want to do is I want to address you in several roles: as a citizen, as a taxpayer, as a consultant, and as a family member. Because all I'm going to talk to you here, it's relevant with regard to all those different roles. First, I'm going to build a burning platform as to how our government's financial condition is on a burning platform, which means we need fundamental transformational change. I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that are going to happen and what some of the implications of those are as it relates to different levels of government, the not-for-profit sector, businesses, as well as individuals. Let me start with the fiscal cliff negotiations, which happened in the beginning of the year. If you look at this, you will see what the projected deficits were before the fiscal cliff negotiations, which, as you recall, extended almost all of the tax cuts except for individuals making $400,000 or more, couples making $450,000 or more with regard to income taxes, and then with regard to capital gains and dividends, $200,000, $250,000 respectively, although the payroll tax, the 2% temporary payroll tax relief, was expired for everybody. The red represents how much was added to the projected deficit as a result of the deal that was done at the beginning of the year. It was all tax increases. It was additional programmatic spending. The only spending reduction that took place was because of a projected reduction in interest cost attributable to tax increases. So that's the backdrop. We know that we avoided having a crisis with regard to the debt ceiling limit, and we know that Friday night at midnight, a sequester is supposed to happen of about $85 billion. It will happen. 95% plus probability that it will happen. Several comments about that before I continue. It's not $85 billion out of $3.8 trillion, which is what the federal government spends a year, because most of the $3.8 trillion is exempt from the cuts. It's $85 billion out of the discretionary spending, and you also have to keep in mind that we're already 5 months through the fiscal year, and by the end of March we'll be 6 months through the fiscal year. So it's really $85 billion out of about $700 billion. So it's over a 10% cut for the balance of this year for defense and for non-defense discretionary spending. It will be felt. It will have an impact, but it will not be cataclysmic, as some people argue that it will be. And in fact, in certain regards, the government can't take certain actions for at least 30 days. For example, the government can't lay off people or furlough people without 30 days notice. In addition to that, if it's a fixed price contract, the government can't cut back on that. If the government has already issued task orders for contractors, they can't pull back on that because of the Prompt Payment Act. On the other hand, if it's a labor hour contract, or if it's a new contract, or if it's a new hire, you can expect that they will freeze that for a period of time. And with regard to discretionary spending that can be delayed for a few months, you can expect that they will do that. Here's the frustration. Whether it be the fiscal cliff or whether it be the sequester, neither one of them deal with the three drivers of our deficits, the three structural drivers of our long-term deficits that represent the disease. Those are demographics. We've gone from 16 people working for every person paying into Social Security in 1950 to 3.2 to 1, and we're going down to 2 to 1 by around 2030. And it's going to stay there. Secondly, healthcare costs that continue to grow much faster than inflation and much faster than the economy. And number three, an outdated and inadequate tax system. So ultimately, we've got to move from looking at short-term crisis to short-term crisis where people are treating the symptoms to where they start trying to come up with a comprehensive bargain that will treat the disease. And to do it in a manner that does not undercut the economic recovery, that does not exacerbate our unemployment problems, but that makes real changes to mandatory spending programs and our tax policies that are phased in over time. That's what we have to do, and you'll see why here in a few minutes. In 2001, I testified before the Senate, and the projected surpluses were the blue dotted line. We had a surplus, and we were projected to have a surplus for at least 10 years. And I cautioned them that you need to be careful, Congress, because number one, these are projected surpluses. They may or may not happen. Number two, they don't have any money in there for contingencies for terrorist events, for contingency operations overseas, for natural disasters at home. Government doesn't budget that way. And in addition, that we knew that because of known demographic trends and rising health care costs, that we were going to have a period of structural deficits that lie beyond the 10-year horizon that was coming. And so therefore be careful. Well, here's what happened. They weren't careful. They were fundamentally imprudent. They took all the high-risk options, none of the low-risk options, and one of the medium options that I laid out that day. And the result is the real deficits are the bars. The purple part are due to the changes in economic conditions and technical factors. The red are due to changes in law, spending increases, tax cuts, expansion of entitlement benefits. So while some of it has to do with changing economic conditions and technical changes, most of it had to do with actions that they took. Now, the federal government has gone from being 2% of the U.S. economy 100 years ago to 23% last year, headed to 37% by 2040. That can't happen. I'm not an anti-government person, but government is not the engine of growth, innovation, and job creation in the economy. We cannot allow this to happen. The question is, when are we going to change course, and how are we going to change course? By the way, this doesn't count state and local. If you counted state and local, government would be over 50% of the economy by 2040. Culturally, that's not acceptable here, and economically not desirable here. Now, at the same point in time, while government's gotten 11.5 times bigger as a percentage of the economy, just the federal government, in the last 100 years, it's totally lost control of the budget. 100 years ago, Congress controlled 97% of the budget. 97% was discretionary. The only thing that wasn't discretionary is interest cost. And while Congress had some control over how much debt we had because of fiscal policy, they couldn't control interest rates. Keep in mind, 1912 was before three things that happened in 1913. Anybody know what three things happened in 1913 that were very big events that fueled the growth of government and undercut states' rights? Federal Reserve System, all right, Federal Reserve System, income tax, and there's a third one. Pardon me? No. Senators were directly elected by the people rather than appointed by state legislatures. Those three things did two big things. They fueled the growth in the size of government, and they undercut states' rights and therefore caused the federal government to assume much more responsibility than had been the case previously. This past year, 64% of the budget was on autopilot. And that 64%, none of the items in that 64% are expressed in the Constitution of the United States. There are social insurance programs, there are agricultural subsidies, there are a variety of things that, while they may be important, they're not expressed and enumerated in the Constitution of the United States. They are dominated by consumption and by seniors. So what's happening is government's gotten bigger, it's lost control of the budget, it's spending more and more on consumption, more and more on seniors, less and less on investment, and less on young people. That is not a prescription for future prosperity, and we've got to change it. This represents projected increases, federal, state, and local deficits moving forward. The problem is not where we are today. The problem is where we're headed. We need to look ahead. You don't fly a plane, you don't drive a car by looking constantly in the rearview mirror. We need to learn from history, we need to learn from others, but we need to see where we're headed and recognize the reality that we're on an imprudent and unsustainable path. And if you look at how much revenues we have coming in compared to mandatory spending alone, and keep in mind the mandatory spending is not in the Constitution, then this is the track that we've been on. More and more of our revenues are being eaten up through mandatory spending programs that don't have a limit. We've written a blank check. You can't do that as a family. You can't do that as a company. You can't do that as a country. And we've got to come to that realization.